this debate is part of, as well as being part of Nano, is part of the Images educational program that we've really tried to beef up this year. And I hope you get to come to some other things. Tomorrow we have a talk with Tanya and Dwayne Linklater about the performance, and Francesco Gigliardi about the performances that are going on today. And it's happening in Urban Space at 4 p.m. tomorrow. So if you'd like to check that out. And then we also have a really exciting talk happening about fair trade filmmaking, about the ethics of the relationship between filmmakers and film festivals. And what are filmmakers getting out of these festivals, what are, with the sort of amount of film festivals that are happening these days. And this sort of interesting relationship moderated by Scott Miller-Berry, and including panelists Magali Samard from TIP, Charlotte Mickey from E1, and Stacey Donan, the programmer at the Royal. And that's happening on, when is that happening? That's happening on Wednesday at 3 p.m. in Urban Space. So if you can make it out to some of those events too, that would be fantastic. And I'm gonna give the floor to Harry from Nano, who is partnering with us in this presentation. So thank you.
I'm not going to yield that mic. I'm Carrie Swanson from the Media Arts Network of Ontario. We are an art service organization dedicated to bringing advocacy, education, and discourse to the media arts community in Ontario. So thank you very much for coming out to this first debate in a planned series. And judging by all of the positive feedback from the numbers here in this room, I think we'll be doing it again. So thanks for being here. And I have a few thank yous for those involved in putting together this debate. Rebecca Groom from Images has been amazing. Thank you, Scott Berry, the board of Nano, and Lauren House for brainstorming this event. Deirdre Logue was also really helpful in brainstorming this at the early stages. And thank you very much to our panel. I'm going to let Jessie Wente introduce them to you. But actually, before I introduce Jessie, I just wanted to say one more thing about Nano. We are doing a media arts symposium in November in Ottawa. It's called Evolve or Perish. So please check us out online for more information about that. I really want to thank Jessie for taking the leap of faith to moderate this panel for us today, this being our first one, and all of us not being sure what we were getting ourselves into. Jessie is the head of film programs at TIFF Bell Lightbox. He's the former film critic for CBC Metro Morning. I've had the pleasure of working with him as, on the programming team at Imaginative, and he's a really great guy. I'm so thrilled that he's Jessie Wente.
Yes, just what you want for the moderator of this, a really great guy. That's the sum of my qualifications. So the question we're going to be debating this afternoon is, does the artist have the right to appropriate the works, words, and images of others, even without their consent or knowledge, in the name of art? Obviously a very large question, which my esteemed panel will answer very definitively for you here this afternoon. So just so you understand the formats, I'm actually going to ask them to introduce themselves in a go-round. Then we'll have opening statements, followed by rebuttal, which is the good part. And then we'll open it up for you guys after that for question and answer. And without further ado, I think we'll begin. So panelists, please begin with the introductions.
Who goes first?
You.
Hi, my name is Althea Thauberger. In relation to the question, my work is often made in cooperation with my subjects, sometimes as co-authors in the creation of a new work. Sometimes their words, works, movement, and decisions are subsumed within my authorship as a director, artist, and instigator. Now, this isn't done without anyone's knowledge or consent, but active participation. But sometimes, quite problematically, this is done without acknowledgement. Like, for instance, if any of you saw the program of films the other night on Friday, it was an oversight on my part to format it for a film screening rather than a gallery installation, whereas if the work's been in a gallery installation, there would have been credits on the wall with co-authorship acknowledged. In this case, there was nothing, so all you saw was my name. So just putting that out there. And of course, these questions are often questions of authorship, are often debated in my work.
Oh, sorry. I'm like looking for a pen. I'm Jane Giluli, and the work that I have in Images Festival is Suitcase of Love and Shame. And in this work, I don't even want to use the word appropriate, but I source audio recordings that were discovered on eBay and reconstruct them into a sort of an experimental narrative of my own sort of imagining. And so what do I want to say about that? Not a lot, actually. So I can honestly say that I did not have any question ever about, whether I would use the tapes. And that's all I'm going to say for now.
Hi. My name is Aaron Schwartz. I helped develop this language called RSS, which made the internet easier to use. I was very interested in this question of copyright and people who wanted to share their work freely and legally on the internet. So we developed this thing called Creative Commons. And the only other thing that you need to know is that I'm 26 years old and I'm dead.
Hi. My name is Abraham Lincoln, and I'm speaking from the Republican side, i.e. the losing side. So just to throw that out there, that while we've been designated this position, our hearts may not be in it, but we're going to fight hard anyway. I'm a 80-year-old man with a heart problem. No, my name's Gabe Klinger, and I'm very happy to be here. John? No. Oh yeah, there you go. I've appropriated your microphone. Keep it.
My name's Josh Mabe. I've got two films in the festival. One is Addie Chu, that's tonight, and then one's tomorrow called Pastoral. Two little 16mm pieces. I guess the Pastoral is largely entirely appropriated image with some like glitchy layering on top of it. So I had a difficult time coming to the no position to which I was assigned. So scoured the internet and found the comments of an intelligent gentleman named Lars Ulrich, who, in speaking in front of a Senate panel on the issue of piracy and Napster, he had some really intelligent things that I've appropriated for my argument, made some slight alterations, but I will be using his words to take the no position.
Hi, I'm Richard Fung. I don't have anything funny to say. So we'll pass it on. Let's get going.
Well, with the threat of Lars Ulrich comments to come, we'll start with the yes side.
Sorry. I guess I knew that. So I'm going to start with some definitions. Appropriate, appropriate. Both the noun and the transitive verb. From Middle English, appropriatin, from Latin appropriatus, past participle of approprio, to make one's own. From add to, proprio, to make one's own. From proprius, one's own, private. Proprius is the root word of the term property. Wiktionary. Also, I'd like to acknowledge briefly some of the problematics of the term right or rights and their universalization. some of which have been interrogated by theorists in recent years, most notably by Giorgio Agamben and Slavoj Žižek, in the case of the latter, specifically in their capacity of reinforcing the interests of Western liberal capitalist societies. I'm reading. Acknowledgement that, for the purposes of this conversation, a framework of terminology of the discussion is implicated in deep-seated notions of ownership, individualism, and capitalism. And for those of us who claim to be working to or perhaps hypocritically claim to be working to undermine the logic of capitalism, or at least working on imagining and enacting alternative models of social relations, we must acknowledge the sort of grand and immense beginning of demise of the system and in these notions of property. And also acknowledge that for many Marxist thinkers, and I'm thinking most specifically of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, but many others, the dematerialization of property that's happening in the last 15 years or so leads irresistibly towards an ease of sharing and a proposal for, or a new reality of a new kind of commons, which is the form of which they argue is actually a form of self-destruction of capitalism, sort of almost perhaps problematically irresistible self-destruction of capitalism through this kind of dematerialization in which sharing and trade through things like file sharing is happening. So the second point I'd like to make, just sort of like locating that, the second point I'd like to make is like figuring out where this debate might most interestingly be located. And on the no side, I'm not sure where they're going to come from, but to argue against any kind of appropriation, I think would simply be arguing against the most important works of modern art and all kinds of ways of making meaning in our time. I think the most compelling arguments, and I'm sort of taking their side for a second, the most compelling arguments against appropriation are on its edges, specifically the instances where there could be harm or violence in the form of assault on the integrity of a person who's represented to individuals or communities, and also instances where there are pretty major asymmetrical power relations, most notably in cases of so-called cultural appropriation, or when the act of appropriation reinforces asymmetries. And these are instances where the ethics of appropriation are most questionable, and they're most interesting territory for this debate, I believe. And I have been accused of making work in the past which is exploitative and which usurps authorship, and I hope and trust that this work can be understood as, these questions and these debates can be understood as part of the content of some of my work, and as well as overall discussion of power dynamics in representation. So I propose that the third point that I'd like to make is the argument, as simply put as I can do it, that I'm making is that, that to argue in favor of the assertion that the artist does have the right to appropriate works of others without their knowledge of consent in the name of art isn't perhaps placing these problematics in the correct territory. That the edges of this debate, or these very difficult questions that I think are very important questions, ought to be centered on how the artist handles the appropriated material, which is also an argument for good art.
I think we should go back to the no side to have an opening statement.
Sure. Get it over with. These are very sensitive mics. Okay. Roughly 10 years ago, I made a film that appropriated a video that appropriated a film by John Huston, who was in fact appropriating Tobago, one of the two parts of the country that I come from. And my uncle's image, I suppose he was being paid for as an extra in a John Huston film, which was shot in Tobago with my Chinese Trinidadian uncle playing a Japanese soldier. And Tobago was pretending to be in the Pacific. And I thought it was pretty fair of me to appropriate the John Huston film. So in that context, I guess I can say that I'm not an innocent in this regard. And there have been great works that have been made using appropriation, including works by some of our panelists. Yet there are times, in my opinion, when borrowing from another source, even when legal and with permission, might not work on conceptual, ethical, aesthetic, or political grounds. And I want to just use 3 examples or 3 sort of thoughts that came to mind. I teach at OCAD University, and I tell my students that I care little about the legal arguments, or in fact the question of right, like who decides that somebody has a right to do something. But I am concerned about the ethical dimension of the question, so that they should consider what they're appropriating, from whom they're appropriating, and for what purpose. So taking images from advertising or mass culture, for example, can amount to a kind of media critique. It's an important part of social critique, and it's, I guess, the fair use, fair dealing argument. Or it could simply be harnessing the kind of effective power of cinema, which Mike does so wonderfully in his own work, working on the huge archive of cinema. But it's another thing for one student to take the work of another student without acknowledging what they're doing, or even in some instances taking the work from other experimental makers without an intention of critique or without acknowledgement. And I think most tempting for students, where I see it most often, is in the use of music. And I try to have a discussion. In my eye, I think taking work from an Adele or a Lady Gaga is somewhat different from taking work from an independent music source without thinking of somebody who's working pretty much at their same level in terms of the possibilities of financial support and being able to survive in the art. What kinds of questions might come up? So the other thing is that often when students do that, the work that comes out is often in the form of a kind of music video, where the music is actually the sort of basis of the work, and so it often is lacking in other terms. So that's one of the kind of questions that I raise. The other example that came to mind was many years ago when I was programming for Inside Out, the Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, LGBTQ Film Festival here in Toronto. There was a documentary that was made about global trans issues. And I was looking at this documentary, and in the middle of it, I recognized, oh, I've seen that image, and I've seen that image. And they had lifted, and I'm sure with complete legality and credits at the end of the film, but a whole section on the Fa'afafine from Samoa, because obviously they didn't have the budget to go to Samoa, so they actually just borrowed this section, and it completely killed the credibility of the film for me. So this is another example in which, even in terms of a completely legitimate borrowing of that work, kind of undermined the film's credibility, and it's something I often think about and also talk about. Then finally, in the Canadian context, certainly of someone of my age, that I can't think of the term appropriation without thinking of cultural appropriation, the debates that happened in Canada in the 1980s and 1990s. And at that time, I think it was a critique raised primarily by Indigenous artists, and many people saw this or critiqued the critique as a kind of essentialism. But I think when I looked at what was actually being talked about, is Indigenous artists were arguing against a cultural appropriation on 2 grounds. One was on the question of protocol. Are there stories that are not meant to circulate that are being put out there? Questions of stereotyping, questions of just sort of inappropriate use of images. And the other one was an economic argument, which was give us the right to make those stories first. And I think you don't hear that argument very much. And that was partly because of the effectiveness of that critique working within the art community and then affecting institutions that has, in a sense, then facilitated the kind of blossoming of Indigenous media making that we see in Canada today. So you don't hear that as much, but I still think that the risks that the critique alerted us to around questions of cultural conflation, stereotyping, all the kinds of things that you often see in Hollywood filmmaking about other cultures, are still relevant when one is making work about a quote-unquote other culture. As I say that, I want to also unsettle the notion of an easy, dichotomy between same and other, right? That's always a complicated question, and I just have to say that also, when I was making videos with my mother, can't get more same than that in a way, those ethical questions about representation still came to the fore. Like, I still had to think about, she had given me the right to use that material, she had done the interview, she raised no questions, but I still had to think through the questions of what did it mean to recirculate these very private conversations of a mother and son in public. So I'm saying that these questions around appropriation, while they can be stated in very legalistic or large terms, we often face them as makers in very kind of minute and small ways.
So I just have a very few things to say, and I might be kind of switching sides. I'll try not to, but don't let me go. Yeah. All right. So in Suitcase and Love and Shame, I argued that this material, or I didn't actually in the Q&A, but I often say that this material to me has such historical significance that I felt immediately that it should be shared. And that my particular approach in using the material was to less about appropriating it, but more about representing it. So rather than, for instance, what an archivist might do with the material, in both instances, the material is repurposed. Does an archivist have any more of a right to decide how material is organized? Or, for instance, what search words will forever be associated with a body of work? What keywords will guide or inform any future researcher who might be experiencing a collection such as the suitcase of audio tapes that I discovered? And I would argue that there should be, there can be, and there really should be multiple views of all material, and historical material especially. One role for the artist is to create an experience that allows a viewer, listener to enter a work, allows an artist to repurpose it, to reframe it, to activate it, and to create some kind of critical and physical, visceral connection between the past and the present, and even if that past is a very recent past. Another side point I wanted to make is that when artists are granted permission, they're still given an artistic license. Material in nonfiction work, as we know, is highly edited. The assumption that an interviewee can predict how they will be represented in a work at the time that they sign a release is false, and makers know that. Usually when a release is obtained, it's a blanket release that gives total control over to the maker of the work. The intended purpose of an interview changes in the edit room, and there's no additional permissions that are ever gone back and re-granted. I mean, occasionally there are. People sometimes will only agree to answer certain questions, and they want to, they maybe will only agree to talk to you unless you're going to sort of like show them cuts of things. But I know most makers who work in nonfiction don't grant those kinds of agreements. And so then that brings me to another point about what is legal if you do have the permission. You know, what is legal is not necessarily ethical. So just because a maker has a legal right to record and use material, that doesn't mean that they should, in all cases, use it. And by extension, what an artist omits from a work, for whatever reason, can be just as misleading or just as damaging to the parties involved, depending on how you view it. The appropriateness is determined by both the artists making the decision about what and how the material is included, how it's included in the work, and how the work is perceived by the viewer-listener. So there isn't and shouldn't be one way to interpret a work or view the appropriateness of appropriation, and I see it very much as a cultural conversation.
Okay. Just like a carpenter who crafts a table gets to decide whether to keep it, sell it, or give it away, shouldn't we have the same options? I authored the image which is the appropriator's lifeblood. We should decide what happens to it, not appropriators. People with no rights to our images, which never invested a penny in our images or had anything to do with its creation. The choice has been taken away from us. What about the users of the appropriated images, the film festival attendee? It's like each of them won one of those contests where you get turned loose in a store for 5 minutes and get to keep everything you can load into your shopping cart. With film festivals that screen appropriated work, though, there's no time limit, and everyone's a winner, except for the artist. If you're not fortunate enough to attend a film festival, there's only one way to view these kind of images: theft. Walk into a gallery screening the work of Shirin Neshat or James Benning, Clint. grab what you want, and walk out. The difference is that the familiar phrase of a festival attendee hears, "There will be a Q&A afterwards," is replaced by another familiar phrase, "You're under arrest."
So maybe you can imagine when I'm talking that I'm actually a character in a comic book. And you know how when characters talk, there's always a little V, just like this table actually, like this. And then there's a little balloon, and you can see each word as it appears. Each word as it appears. All the words that I'm going to use today are not my words, actually. I stole them all. I never invented a single word I ever said in my whole life. And so all I really do with language, I don't know whether you ever feel this, like I take this kind of collection of my stolen words and I just move them around like little shells. And that collection of language is sometimes what I like to name as my personality. But often, actually, I find, don't you find that the collections even are just the same as everyone else's collections? Hi, how are you? I just like to repeat the same sort of tropes over and over again. And it's so hard to tell when I'm talking, like who I am, where I stop, and where you start. You know, one of these, I'm remembering Marcus Boone's genius book on copying. What is it called again? And he makes this extravagant argument for it, even including genetics, like the way that the DNAs come together. He said, well, genetics, it's just copying, isn't it? And it's just a question of splicing, of collage, of montage. In other words, not just our language, but horrifyingly our physical structures are actually just bits and pieces of what's already existed. So maybe in terms of the debate of copyright or copy wrong, maybe it's a question of degree or circumstance, particular instances, as many of the panelists have already pointed out. To the notes. So just this morning, copyright, it seems like such a pressing new question, doesn't it? But I'm imagining, what if instead of being here on Clinton Street, we were in Rome, we're talking about, oh yes, it's another panel about copyright, because there's this form of poetry, it's called the cento. It means it's a cloak made of patches, little patches that already exist, and you stick them together and they make a cloak. It's a Roman form of poetry that is entirely made of stolen bits of verse. And as usual, of course, there's rules. As you know, most people that live outside the law like to have rules to contain and control these activities. So this is just to say that maybe this argument's been going on for a long time, but there's particular features which are specific to this moment, maybe, where more and more pictures, sounds, and texts are in circulation. So one question I just wanted to raise, because I've been waiting to hear it, is how do I get paid in this new economy? They promised that the internet would be free. It's great, and it's free-flowing and circulating so much. One strange thing seems to have happened is that it seems to be the site of this tremendous monopoly capitalism. You know? Like there's just a few companies that seem to own everything there, and so they're making money. But the content, somehow they've rigged it up so that the providers get everything. It's kind of like the person in the middle makes the money, but the people on the other end, well, I guess someone pays, but the provider doesn't seem to ever get anything back. So I just wanted to float that out there as a question. Of course, I'm for this circulation of language. I think people should speak as they would like. Imagine getting taxed every time you had to say, hi, how are you? Because someone said, I invented that, or my mother invented that word, you know? Anyway, that's it, yep.
All right, the benefit of going last is you can reassess your own thoughts based on the really smart and intelligent things that other people have already said. Thank you all for opening up the debate in such a beautiful way. Richard, pondering your comments, I think, about cultural appropriation in particular, I was going to bring up the idea that this debate could go comically, in a direction that's black and white, really. And I was training myself to try to point my finger at you guys and say, shame on you, and, all that type of stuff. But actually, there's a whole lot more to it. It's not just about stealing. It's about the playing field where we get ideas from not being even. And so there are all kinds of cultural considerations there about who gets to steal and who doesn't get to steal. And sometimes we can actually make those assessments, and they can sound pretty fair. So, somebody with a lot of economic resources might be able to create something from scratch, whereas a person with not a lot of resources maybe has to depend on other people, maybe as simple as that or as complicated as that sounds. When we get to the level of to actually getting the work out there, and when it comes back to us, is when I think there are really important things we can do to actually level that playing field. What Mike was referring to, or throwing out that last question, I'm reminded of something that the comedian Louis C.K. did recently, which is put out a comedy special that he did not through Netflix or HBO, but directly onto his own website, thus eliminating the middleman and retaining those profits, and actually then distributing those profits to the people in his organization who he worked with. So not only is he providing an economic model that's perhaps more fair and sustainable for the artist, but also just an indicator of human kindness and generosity, how we can get this work, or if we do it right, then the whole community profits from it. And the notion that we have from big corporations and what they do, or the way that they work, is it's all going in the pockets of people that we never see or never really producing the art, and we have to starve and kind of cling and try to find the ways to find those resources to make what we make. And I guess I'm really excited about what the future holds in terms of the digital realm, trying, leveling that playing field, which is going to bring up a lot of issues of responsibility, a lot of issues of fairness, and it's not going to be that black and white issue anymore, which you read if you go on internet forums about piracy and things like that, where people pointing fingers at other people and saying, you're stealing. Well, it's not stealing, we're allowed to. Well, but I own it, and things like that. Yeah, it's going to be a lot more interesting, I think, in the future. It already is. So that was kind of a rebuttal already. So
it already is interesting, or already is the future?
It already is. It's sci-fi.
So I think we should formally begin the rebuttal process. I think it's a free-for-all.
Free-for-all.
So,
so what's
no
happening
order.
now? So it's not them? Or
Yeah,
Well, let's start here, and then we can open it up to the floor.
I don't want to wait too long.
No, we won't wait too long. But some of the common arguments that came up was around ethics of appropriation. Perhaps a question to look at is cultural appropriation separate from the overall debate around rights and sort of the economics, shall we say, of appropriation?
Say it again.
Is cultural appropriation, the notion of that, somehow different on an ethical, economic, is it separate from the other arguments around appropriation? So is cultural appropriation somehow different, or are we under a different set of rules and standards than, say, borrowing a Lady Gaga song?
Well, I would argue that a consideration of power dynamics are never something that should not be considered in any kind of situation, whether it be the work of an artist or our lives. So in that case.
So how does that play into your role as someone on the yes side, that the artist is always free to appropriate?
Yeah. Well, I would say that the artist ought to be free to appropriate in a thoughtful way. But it's that the artist ought to be, this is my argument. I'm not sure that I entirely stand behind it, but for the purposes of this panel, my argument is that the artist ought to if they decide to entitle themselves to availing themselves of materials in the world or materials by another author, that their treatment of that material and their decisions around working with that material ought to be governed by a sense of responsibility and care.
And who's determining that?
Well, presumably the artist. And my argument is that if an artist is not working with that material in a way that's careful, they're making bad art.
I want to say that.
Change seats.
Actually, I see the really.
But it's not to say they ought not do it.
Right. There's a really interesting tension about, for example, in a mentor-student type of relationship you may have with a college professor who's producing artwork, and you admire that person and you want to use that. How do you approach that person about it? You have to have really good ideas. And when you have really good ideas, somebody's going to be receptive to your work automatically. If you have bad ideas, they're going to say, no, you can't steal my work because your idea is terrible. What you're going to do to my work is terrible. But if I think that discussion, it has to come from a place of ideas, of good ideas. What's that?
But then how do you hold the artist to creating the good idea, the intended idea?
Well, it starts with the intention. Everything starts with the intention, right?
Mm-hmm. But then the execution, there's all these other ways to move around.
Sure, but then it's too late.
Yeah.
But that's okay too. I mean, and that the risk is maybe part of what makes it desirable.
So 10 years ago, I made a movie about my friend Tom, and he was in an advanced stage of Parkinson's, which meant that he shakes a lot and he has very unusual movements, and it's hard to read it in a way, like unless you've been with him around him quite a bit, it's hard not to see him, like he looks like a dangerous lunatic, when he's walking down the street. So what I wanted in the portrait was to show this, to have this feeling tone, like this feeling that the atmospheric thing, that hit that you get off someone. That's what I wanted to come across. And so I lied. I didn't show him, like, there was some shaking, but not the forever shaking that he's really doing. Not to mention, I didn't have a 10-minute shot of him being paralyzed in bed. So the other piece of that portrait was that in the couple of days that we had, like, chit-chat interview style things, we'd known each other for years. So for some reason, he was super soft. He was so soft. And he cried many times. And for whatever reason, the deaths of his father and his brother was very close to him. It just happened to be like that, And so that's the recording that I had. So later, cut to how many years later, the movie's finally done. It shows in front of some of his friends. They go, wow, like I don't know that Tom. Like that voice, I've never heard that voice. It's unrecognizable to me, particularly for those for whom they knew him as like this leather-wearing SM top. Like, who's this soft guy crying all the time about his dad, So is that, there was never a question of permission or not permission, but is it true? Is it okay? Which of the voices, of the many voices that he had, was I actually going to have, how much can a movie contain? Or are we always making a sort of an unfair and unreasonable cut? Yeah.
Thanks again. We don't need to do anything. Let them talk.
Yeah.
Do you want to read more from your Lars Ulrich statement?
I thought there was going to be time later to read from that, but no, I can wait.
Well, I'm going to just share an anecdote too about a work. And so in the mid-90s, I made a film where I took a police file photograph that had been stolen from a police file, and it was a picture of a woman's dead body on a motel room floor. And it had been used, and it was always attributed as an anonymous woman. So I made a film that sort of not recreated the events, but sort of like just told the story that led up to the event of her death. And she had died of an illegal abortion. So because the picture had become quite well known in the United States, printed in newspapers, magazines, carried on signs at pro-choice rallies and whatever. A lot of people knew the picture. No one claimed like ownership to it. I was claiming a fair use usage of it, and that by the publishing of the work that I did that was broadcast on PBS, I inadvertently became sort of the copyright holder of that image because I copyrighted the film. So ever since I've made that film, anyone else who wants to use this doesn't seem to feel the same sort of privilege that I felt that I could use it as fair use. They contact me and ask me permission to use it. So I'm now this sort of gatekeeper of this image, and I, occasionally will get calls from people who say, "Can I use this?" So I have a relationship now with the family of the dead woman, and so I decided that the way that I would sort of attribute someone's ability to use it would be if they're willing to call this dead woman's sister and ask permission. They can get permission from her. But I do think it's sort of interesting that by copywriting a work, I became somehow the owner of this image in the United States, and whatever. It's kind of twist things upside down.
But to switch sides a little bit, I think the kind of question you're raising also has the cultural implication. I mean, I'm still struck by Jean-Marie Thénault's comments yesterday about responding to the whole colonial legacy of image making in Africa. And the question you raised reminds me of the instance of Eyes on the Prize, the great civil rights documentary that couldn't be screened after a certain point because they couldn't afford to keep up with the rights for all the footage. Now, when you have that kind of situation where African Americans can't access their own history because of copyright regimes, that's where the legal argument and the legal kind of questions really come to the clash with the ethical arguments, it seems to me.
I'd mention a recent example, and I'm very ambivalent about it, but James Benning appropriated footage recorded by the political group Voina and Pussy Riot in Russia and made a film called The War. Now what he did is he took the material that you'd see on the news pretty regularly, like Pussy Riot playing in the church, or the big penis that's graffitied onto the drawbridge, and the drawbridge comes up and the penis is erect, and all kinds of things like that. That maybe you saw, but you saw in bits and pieces, and you saw it through news sources that weren't necessarily representing Voina accurately, and maybe they were translating in their own way or providing their own commentary over it, which would put it into another context. And what James wanted to do is he wanted to take all that material and present it sort of integrally. And then he worked with a Russian translator to actually translate very meticulously what was being said in all of these clips. And so it was a very fair portrait of Voina and Pussy Riot. And what happens? James starts to show the film publicly and receives a letter from Voina, who are in exile in Georgia and currently sought by the Russian authorities, saying, "We don't want you to represent us. We don't want you to appropriate our materials, you bourgeois American artist." And James, if you know James Benning, he's probably the last person you'd call a bourgeois American artist. Although, a group like Voina, they're just radical enough that they might look at somebody like James Benning that way, who, as we all know, is not making millions of dollars from his work. And as recently as I think a couple of weeks ago, James received a cease and desist letter from Voina's lawyers, so now they have legal representation. So once they put all this material very freely on YouTube, and it was meant to be appropriated by everybody. And once the tables turned, and they were in fear of being prosecuted, they completely changed their position about it, which is interesting. I don't know what it says about anything that's going on, but I just thought I'd bring it up as an interesting example that's ongoing.
Why don't we have a vote
Yeah.
on whether James should be able to show his movie or not?
Yeah.
Like, who thinks that it's okay? Maybe people could just raise their. Who thinks it's okay that?
When's it showing, Phil? Just to say
What's it showing? Oh, it's
Oh.
still showing.
Well, privately.
I see.
What's interesting too is that somebody else actually uploaded it to Vimeo and allowed people to download it freely, and he did a cease and desist against that person who uploaded it.
That's right.
Ben
I
is good.
managed to catch that and download it, so.
I mean,
Some people downloaded copies of it, so.
I'll share another anecdote. I wrote James, and I downloaded that copy as well, and I sent an email to James, and I said, "Do you mind if I show this at a film festival?" And he said, "Absolutely not." And I saw him a couple weeks later, and I said, "You know, I broke your instructions." And he said, "All right, that's exactly what you should have done."
Just want to open it up.
Well, there's a question, I think, in the back.
Let's open it up
Yeah.
to questions. Yep.
I guess in some ways I understand their point, and it's interesting, this idea of portraiture, and I understand that this James doing what he did was James doing what he did, but the fact is that it's James then putting his name on what he did, and I kind of wonder in that case why have his name on it. If it's meant as a portrait of what they did and he's going to release it and it's going to get into festivals, that in a way, I can understand this idea of the bourgeois thing because, of course, there's then the legacy of James Benning, and it kind of plays into a sort of canonical notion of the elite of avant-garde sort of process that we're undergoing. I say this because I think I brought this up the other day. I was recently, I did this workshop, and I had to approach somebody about the process that was used, and it sort of gets into the whole patent issue here. That there's a tape process that was used on the film that I saw in another film. I asked people, can I show people this? They said, well, it was invented by somebody else who has no patent on this thing. And yet somehow there was some kind of question about the claim made to who started this process. However, my goal is not to use it myself and say this is Rob Todd's process. My goal really is to say somebody made this process, let's all use this process. And so I think there's something, there's sort of a tension possibly within a certain notion of the avant-garde and sort of the sort of quasi-socialist sharing nature of it versus the elitist notion of like the name Rob Todd, for example, like what the hell is that doing on this process? As a sort of a lightning rod thing. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that kind of thing, but when I come to vote on the James Benning thing, I'd have some kind of, I'd want James to take his name off if I were him too, and just say, show the damn piece, but take his name off.
Well, but you have to see the piece first. Have you seen it, Rob?
No, but I mean, I guess I've done something like this too, where I've made a piece and I won't show it with my name on it.
Right. Well, the thing is, it's not just Pussy Riot. I mean, it's a structural film, and the way he's set it up, he's doing. There's a very specific intention behind it. So it's a James Benning film, 100%. So I would argue that he is, he's not representing them. That's the mistake, is that Pussy Riot and Voina think that he's trying to represent them. That's not, in fact, what's being done. Is he's taking it and he's rendering it in his own way. And then there are for and against issues that go hand in hand with that.
But I think that
also did this to Michael Snow's work, and I think we should defend the Eden Center a little bit as well. We put like ribbons around, flight stop. Just be provocative. I don't know. Ben, you can do it. Why can't Edens? They had a whole panel of people saying it's good too. Good art. They went for a lot of people, I'm sure. Does anybody know about this?
It's the moral rights question about whether an artist has the right to protect the visage of their art as it's exhibited. But it's very different from digital appropriation because when you digitally appropriate, you make a copy. And Michael Snow's piece is a sculpture. It's
You
not
can take those ribbons off or something.
If an artist were to take Michael Snow's Flight Stop, which is a piece in the Eaton Center, and then set it up in a gallery with ribbons around it to signify the commercialization of Michael Snow's art in the public sphere, that would be an interesting piece of art. But what the Eaton Center did is they corrupted Michael Snow's piece against his wishes, whether or not they purchased it or not. They violated the moral rights clause, and that could open things up. Does an artist have
Did James Benning have the right then?
But that's the thing, he made a copy.
I think the difference is
Nora is a part of that.
the question was posed to us as, do artists have the rights? And the question that you're rephrasing is, do corporations have the right? I know that, for example, the song, what's the anthem? Rise Up, Rise Up. I mean, the authors of that song had to go to court, I believe, to prevent that song being used as an ad to sell things. And the whole purpose of that, sorry? French fries, yeah. The whole purpose of the song was against corporatism. So then the moral argument comes about, who has the right and how are those rights negotiated?
Mm-hmm.
James Benning would be a real artist, quote unquote, a good artist, whereas like the Eaton's graphic designer would be a quote unquote bad artist,
But I guess I'd just like to, since no one's saying anything, I'd like to take issue with this notion that James Benning is not an American bourgeois artist. I mean, I have no idea how much this guy has. I have no idea how rich he is or how poor he is, but he's definitely within an elite. That, so just putting that out there.
Yeah, but he's not a corporate. I mean, I don't know if he's profiting from this piece.
Well, it's not a question of his. He's profiting in some way. He's profiting because he's gaining credibility through this work. So he's gaining credibility and cachet, and that's kind of like the project of the that's. I mean, one can argue critically against the work that I do, is that's what I get too, right? But
you're on the wrong side here. We should switch sides.
But I think.
For representing the images, he's not being put in jail like the subjects are. So in that sense, he's not kind of on that line of it. But on the other hand, he's furthering the discussion.
But on the other hand, if he's making a work supposedly in support of these people, you'd think a starting point would be some kind of negotiation as to whether they're cool with it. I mean, that would be the
But clearly he's not making a work in support of them. He's using this material in order to make a work that will further his practice. I mean,
I'm not in a position to
I'm
say
not
clearly,
actually. I shouldn't say
haven't
that either.
seen the work, so I don't know
I
what.
shouldn't say that either.
But for what it's
but not
worth,
to say he ought not or he ought to, but it's an interesting example, and obviously a really apt example.
For what it's worth, I've stopped putting the little C on my work. Not that technically it means anything, and it's a very small gesture. Nobody wants to appropriate my work anyway. If only, I'd be so happy.
Exactly, it seems so prestigious.
But I have actually done that, and I've stopped doing that. It was embarrassing, I'll tell you. The piece that I did that was appropriating the John Huston film, we kind of just did it out of, because that's what you do. And every time it's screened, I'd be so embarrassed. Because here it was making this gesture of, I own this piece that was completely made of my reappropriating of the Huston work. And I think that in fact has been such an important and interesting kind of post-colonial reworkings, right? Like Kent Monkman's work is so much about reappropriation. And I think often we do have to reappropriate to help understand the power of those original images that have defined so many colonized people. So, me on this side, I want to be on that side for a moment.
One thing that's interesting, just in relation to what people have been saying about the James Benning thing, is that the technology is already faster than the artist's intention or the Pussy Riot intention, or because the tech has a momentum, and digital technology is not like analog technology. The copy looks the same as the original. And I think most of us are living in a world where copying is a kind of everyday, ordinary, ubiquitous experience. And because even the very small, personal, marginal kinds of pictures that show at festivals like Images, like even piles of those are very easily accessible and available on the internet. And it's just a question of time before one would be able to mount an entire festival created out of someone's going to sample bits and pieces of all those different kind of avant-gardisms and recollage them, right? I think it's kind of inevitable, I think. So there's a split then between an artist's intention, or what you hope, this question of ethics, which I think is really important, but then it gets displaced, like across this, across the internet, where so much accessibility and the easy ability to replicate really puts this question of ethics into a different place, I think.
But it seems to me it's like a little bit like fashion, like fashion from 2010 isn't ready to be recirculated yet. It looks old, right? You have to wait a little. There has to be a certain distance before something comes into style again. And so I think in terms of reappropriating, and this is a more, I guess, a conceptual or an aesthetic argument, is there has to be some distance, whether it's a distance between the level of production from a DIY work appropriating a commercial or a mainstream music video or a big film. So that kind of financial distance, a difference of kind of economic register, or a kind of an aesthetic difference that makes that work appropriatable and then that has credibility artistically. It seems to me that like fashion, there needs to be, or a time, right? Like if I'm just appropriating a Mike Holboom, it'll be just like me. People will see it as me stealing Mike Holboom's ideas, right? There has to be some kind of, perhaps I can go back and do
I totally disagree with you because it seems like to me you're arguing for cool.
Well, no, it's not just cool. It's the way that I think when we look at work, that it would be okay for me to appropriate perhaps wavelengths or something like that because it's moved into another domain.
Okay, so you're speaking of peers appropriating peers' work.
Yeah, but distance. There seems to me, I'm just trying to understand something myself because it occurs to me that like fashion, there needs to be a kind of a distance, whether it's temporal, across register, across form, that allows for the work to have an appropriation, to have credibility. So for instance, in your work, for example, at the power plant, there is a question of time, there is a question of movement, there's a geographical shift. The fact that you're taking this story that's set in France and then, putting it in the former Yugoslavia. I think I'm
former
right.
Czech Republic.
Czech Republic, sorry.
Or former, I should say, Czechoslovakia.
Former Czechoslovakia.
Czech Republic.
Yes. But, so there are those kinds of distances that allow us to see it fresh and experience it as anew and having commentary. But somehow, if things are too close,
I don't know. I just
I
completely
can't think
disagree
of the
with what you're saying.
Give me an example.
Like, for example, Omer Fast's work, where he appropriated these snippets of CNN. Like, for example...
But it's CNN. That's the thing. It is that distance.
Okay, so you're speaking specifically about... you're speaking about a different kind of register, and you're speaking of a proximity of artists.
Yes,
work.
that's what I mean. That there seems to be either temporal, so it's like enough time has gone, so we look at it as a commentary on time, or a register of small production to large production, or across genres, or across geographies. But it seems to have necessitate that kind of distance to make it work.
Someone in the audience has
it becomes culturally ubiquitous. So Mickey Mouse, for example, who owns Mickey Mouse? It's not Disney anymore. It's so thoroughly ingrained in the culture that maybe.
Oh, no, Disney owns Mickey.
Oh no, I know, and they're taking it to the Supreme Court, and they'll have Mickey Mouse for another 200 years if that lobby is pretty strong. But I mean, maybe it's a losing battle. There's so many different. Materializations of Mickey Mouse and Betty Boop and all these different things. And for us, for our little community, Michael Snow's wavelength is
I think actually
is part of that. I don't know.
The thing that you're talking about is that appropriation, at the heart of the kind of appropriation you're talking about, is to pick up a piece of something that has a lot of associations involved with it. So it's not just like when you pick up a piece of Michael Snow, you're not just picking up a piece of a film that Michael Snow made. You're also picking up an entire kind of like discourse. You're picking up a particular part of history that's already been, and I think this is kind of the distance that you're with it, that's already sort of been figured, and there's like just many, many kind of dimensions to that, and that kind of thing takes time in order to sort of bring that kind of like layering of content through a fragment, right? So that's what you're talking about. But
No.
I would say that that's, no, okay, it's not what you're talking about.
But no, that's only one dimension, because I think that the shift in register happens along a number of axes. So the temporal one is one. But for instance, your work, it's the context, right? You've taken a very intimate thing and moved it into another realm. Alison Kobayashi did that in her first video. Name anyone? Details?
From
From Alex to Alex. right? Again, taking something very private and recirculating it, reperforming it differently. So again, that moves from a register of the very private into the public.
I want to. I'm sorry if anyone else is. I would just want to briefly mention. I was having a really interesting conversation with Eli Langer a couple of days ago, and it was after your screening actually, and he was talking about a film by a Los Angeles artist, who I won't say the name, but you probably know the work. I didn't know the work, where he had gotten a hold of this footage that was taken by, I guess, the LAPD in the early 60s of. Yeah, that's the work. Is that Eli? No, someone's saying. So what is his name? William Jones? James? So you guys know, if you know the work, you can speak about it. But he was speaking about this work in the context of as a work that uses found footage in a very different way, that actually somehow seems to re-exploit its subjects through naming them and so it's basically footage of men in a washroom having sex, and in which everything is shown, and I think that these kind of when we're speaking about distance, it's like it's still kind of I haven't seen the film, but I imagine that I would have the same difficulties with it he did. That it's still not okay, you know.
It's made with secret cameras.
Yes, sorry, I should say it's made with secret cameras.
If I could. I actually did have recently seen this. No, it's police footage. It's police footage.
More about it. I don't know the work.
Yeah.
Like surveillance kind of footage.
Yeah, I have to say, I just saw that in the context of the Leslie Norman Museum and an exhibition curated mostly out of Canada, actually. Kelly McRae and thank you. That was, and so the Leslie Norman, for those of you who don't know, is a queer art museum. I think it's the only one in the world. It's in New York City. And so it was so interesting and for me fascinating to watch myself watching it and to watch everybody else looking at these, because what you had was the performance of sexuality, of sex, but you're filtering it through the gaze of a police camera, and the policemen are very proud of what they're doing, and you know that the men are arrested after these moments of shared sexual pleasure. Right? So it's a very interesting thing to watch, and I think that there's a richness to that. I did have to think, okay, so what does it mean to circulate these in public? Does it mean that people who may have been in the closet in that period, people might recognize their uncle so-and-so or their grandparents? But it's also within that circle. You think anybody who's going to be in that gallery looking at it. Now, I think, would not bring the kind of judgment that perhaps one might fear. So that there is that kind of ethical lingering question, but in terms of that piece, even though the piece is recirculated completely whole and unaltered, there was again for me that distance and recontextualizing it just by who is watching it and the lens by which we're watching it now, today. I'm completely arguing on your side.
And I'm arguing on the other side.
You're using appropriated materials, it's sort of like we have a material we're using. It's not just empty, right? Is there like a sensuality that's in that material? Why aren't you guys discussing anything other than the politics? Because we have something like a tool that we're using. It circulates. It's inevitably here. So the panel, I think, really needs to address the fact that appropriation is inevitable.
Yeah, but we've already figured that out. Now we're trying to figure out, like, what are the sort of, like, gray zones, maybe.
Yeah, but no one talks about sexuality. No one here is talking about it. We can talk about the politics of it. But I want to know about if you have a 16 mil that you're using in video, why are you using that as a text?
Well,
right? I think that that's an important thing to talk about.
Maybe you want to say something more about it.
Pleasure of watching, or the pleasure of taking, and the pleasure of subsuming something, and having our biases replete within something, so that within the thing that we're taking, we're always going to have a problematic relationship with that thing. But we can be seduced by it as well. It can be invariably
I think
But I
my
think that's
film.
something totally at play in Jane's work too, but yeah.
I think my film that plays on Monday, Pastoral, was just on that. Speaks to a lot of the things you just talked about, where it was my reasons for appropriating brackage in that were it's videotaped off of a screen playing the by brackage DVD. It's shaky. It's not anything like that. And then I just layer lots of glitchy green elements on top of it. And it existed for a long time as a video piece, just like it existed for 3-4 years as a video piece. I think I showed it at a Glitch Fest. I think that's the only, it was a local friend running a festival and he played it. But it just existed as a video piece for the longest time. And I knew to complete the gag, to make it appropriate, it had to be back out on 16 in order for it to be a proper, tribute's the wrong word, tribute to Brackage and his work and the passion and the love that I have for his work. And my reasons for appropriating it weren't, it's a weird with the distance thing because it was made in the mid-90s. It's relatively recent work. I understand his son's in town. I don't know what people close to him would feel about it. I haven't even shown it to Fred Camper in town. I probably should at some point. But anyway, it's just my reasons. At first, I didn't know why I was doing it, but my reasons for appropriation were sort of illuminated by Phil Solomon when he came through town 2 years ago or something. He mentioned that an early work of his, which was Dog Boy versus the something something, it was an early Super 8 thing. Does anybody know what that's called? Dog Boy versus... Anyway, he made this piece that used a lot of brackagey tropes, a lot of the 60 brackagey stylistic elements and tropes, because he loomed so large as an influence over his work that he had to not take him down a peg, but just sort of like deal with it in a comical way, just sort of like take a loving jab at the work. And I felt like that's what I was doing with this piece too, is like his work loomed so large in my mind and so large in my work that I just had to, I had to poke a hole in it somewhere. And that was my reason for appropriating that.
Can I just respond to JB's thing? I think part of the reason why that hasn't come up perhaps is that the question as it was phrased to us didn't really send us in that direction. Yeah. But I think that one of the attractions of people appropriating material is that when you take something from one object form, however, object is like as dematerial as you can think of an object as a film or a video file, and you move it into another context, what is attractive is partly that it's dragging bits of the traces of the aura of the original into the new form. And I think that that's what's interesting for those of us who work with appropriated forms. Now, I'm saying that as somebody who doesn't necessarily appropriate always in the sense that I'm bringing that John Huston, but when I was bringing that John Huston, what was partly attractive to me was taking that Hollywood film and recirculating it within the little video image, which was, I noticed it's not free anymore. It was on the CCA site for free for a long time. But I've also used television imagery, I've used Super 8 footage, and of course, when you use Super 8 footage and you recycle it, part of that is bringing the whole discourse of the 60s, the suburban, the rise of Kodak Super 8 into whatever medium you're using. So I think I think all of us who appropriate are attracted to that phenomenon, perhaps, when we appropriate.
There was a question. Actually, I just wanted to comment that I wanted to bring it back to politics. Sorry. But there are politics inherent in the way that you choose to copy material. So if you're filming off of a TV screen, or you're filming in a movie theater, or if you're digitally copying a file and you're transcoding it approximately in the way that it actually is, or other forms, or you're just simply appropriating a digital algorithm to create another universe. For example, Phil Solomon's work using Grand Theft Auto comes to mind. And the reason I think behind doing that is he said, look, I would do this material from scratch myself, but I'm really clumsy. and I can't stage these kinds of shots, and I've never worked with a professional crew. And here suddenly is this entire world, the Grand Theft Auto world, and I can appropriate this, and I can create these elaborate tracking shots and helicopter shots, and get in a car and film from the side, and all these things that I have no budget and no experience doing. Somebody created that for me, and I'm able to manipulate it using, let's say, a digital algorithm. So I mean, I don't think it's the same thing as, for example, sitting in a movie theater and copying a movie off of a screen and then using it later or doing something like that. You're really, you're as Richard was saying, you're dragging things in, and so inevitably,
Why
for example,
is it different?
Because there's, for example, the work that Phil Solomon does with Grand Theft Auto. You can see that there's an understanding of the materiality. You can see that there's a real passion for it. He fell in love with that world.
How would there not be a passion for understanding the materiality of filming off of a movie screen in a theater used by an artist?
Yeah, and and there's this really great line that Nathaniel Dorsky said, that if you can only understand digital through film, so by filming a digital object with a film camera, then it reveals what the digital medium is. So I think, yeah, there are exceptions to that. What I'm thinking more is the sort of lazy appropriation, sort of art school appropriation of taking something from the internet or filming it off a screen and then just rendering it in your own way. And there's just, doesn't seem to be any material engagement with it. It's just, it cheapens it. I will say, as just kind of a slight tangent, I do love, and I'm a huge fan of bootlegs online, cam bootlegs. And I try to download them of big movies like Batman, because they're documentaries about movie screenings. And if you look at them, you see people in the audience, coming into the frame. You see all kinds of things happening. You see, there's even like a Seinfeld episode about it, I think, where Jerry and Kramer get into this underground world of bootlegging, and they become filmmakers in the process because they're reframing certain shots in movies that they're seeing in the multiplex. So I find that really fascinating. Here, wherever else.
I have a question for Jane. I loved your film, and I thought it was amazing because it brought up so many of these questions that we're discussing today. And I was interested when you were asked the question about ethics in the Q&A, that you said that it was never a question of ethics for you, and there was no dilemma in that regard. My question is around your choices, and particularly the choice to use a lot of sexually explicit content in the film. And because of, I think, the date that the recordings were made, a lot of it was, there were giggles from the audience, and I think a lot of people found it funny because it was so dated, the language that was being used. But this was also a very traumatic, sort of intense experience for those involved. So my question is around the perhaps dehumanizing element that appropriation can have. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can understand that maybe you interpreted it that way, that somehow it felt dehumanizing to you. I didn't feel that. And so I think my earlier comment is about, it's really how it's perceived by the listener and the viewer. I mean, to tell you the truth, I've actually had very few times when audience members did question the use of the material. It just doesn't, even though the question gets raised, people want to know whether I thought about it. I don't usually think that people raise the question because they think I shouldn't have used it. But in some cases, when I was doing test screenings and I wasn't telling people, putting it in complete context, I did have one or two occasions when people were very upset because they thought they were listening to actors. And when they realized they weren't listening to actors, it upset two people once very much. And I was thinking about that, and about how really what they were upset about was their personal response to it. Maybe they felt betrayed, or maybe they felt tricked, or something like that. But that's not what I'm trying to do. And so I am often trying to let people realize like the source of the material before they walk in and view or listen to it. But in terms of dehumanizing, I actually didn't really feel like I was. And part of it is you don't know who they are. And I'm fairly confident that I can say no one will be able to identify them. I could have identified them and I didn't. And so I feel like that uncomfortable, you know, that the way that you feel uncomfortable, I felt that way. So I don't feel like I'm presenting or doing something to the audience that wasn't my own personal experience of it. So I felt at various times sorry for the couple, but elated for the couple. I thought each of them were like really incredibly engaging in a lot of ways. I thought Jeannie was actually quite a brilliant person. She was quite manipulative actually in this and had a lot of control. And I think different people view it different ways. I do actually want to point something out is that when I write about the film, I always, for instance, say it's a Midwestern woman and her lover. And I'm always curious because frequently I see that sentence rewritten where it says a Midwestern man and his mistress. And so, and I'm like, and I'm actually trying to figure out, like, you know, when that's rewritten, like, who's doing it? Like, who's, you know, so people bring their own perspective into it, and people leave the theater with something that they projected in a lot of cases. So there is a power dynamic between Jeannie and Tom, certainly. She was the more vulnerable person in the relationship, but she had a lot of control. She was the one who was dragging that tape recorder. She was creating the sex scenes. She was, you know, holding the mic and checking the levels. I mean, that was a lot of her doing. So, you know, it's complicated, I think, and different people walk away with it feeling different things. So, but I don't mean to dismiss your personal effect is how you felt. I mean, I don't mean to dismiss that.
Can I ask you a question about the material? It's credited as being discovered by Albert Stagg. He bought it offline. He's the archivist for the Baseball Hall of Fame, right?
Well, he had been briefly.
He was. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, is the material in an archive, or do you still hold it, or does Albert hold it, or?
No, I hold it. I actually, he discovered, and he knew I was looking for collections, and so he called me and asked me whether he should put a bid on it because he found it. So, but he is the one who discovered it. But it's basically I own it now. And I am trying to decide. I'm doing other things, other works with it right now. But I am trying to decide, like, where does it belong after this?
Right.
And I'm not just like making this up when I say I feel like it's sort of historically significant. I think that it is. When you listen to the whole 60 hours, there's so much more information in there. And you did bring up, like, there is a certain amount of sexual content that I use. And that's some of the more restrained sexual conversations that they had. So I was really trying to make sure that the sex didn't completely overtake the piece. But so in answer to, like, what do I do with it now? If I were to deposit it in an archive or give it to the, you know, National, you know, Archives or something, then I'd have to give everything, and then people would know who they were. So then I sort of have made this piece that's kind of made this collection somewhat famous, and everyone's curious about who they are, and then people would go and seek it out. So I don't really know. I do sort of wonder, like, what will I decide to do at that point? So I can't answer what I'm going to do. But
okay. Well, Midwest Sex Archive. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I had my hand up a long time ago, but I'm not going to speak directly about that. But a couple of things I wanted to talk about or respond is the idea when we appropriate, sometimes it's about wanting to align ourselves with a particular politics. Like, you appropriating Brackage is partly about you putting yourself in line with Brackage in terms of a lineage of male avant-garde filmmakers, right? And part of Benning, and the way you describe the story of Benning is really interesting, like clearly coming from a perspective of someone who deeply respects, is potentially in love with Benning. I'm in love with Sadie Benning, so I totally. I can relate.
He made her.
He made her.
And so I think also about Benning putting his work in line with Pussy Riot is very different than you putting your work in line with Brackage. trying to stay relevant in a politically charged context and, you know, hooking your work onto Pussy Riot is really interesting. There's a lot of work that's up at Oakville Galleries and the Feminist Utopia show, and a lot of the artists are appropriating earlier feminist work. In fact, the majority of the work in the exhibition is about appropriating earlier work. So I think that there's, to get back to the politics, but also include the material in how we feel about the work that we're appropriating and why we want to put our work in line with it is an important thing to consider.
Yeah, because my personal pantheon of filmmakers, you get Brakhage and Ernie Gare and Julie Murray and Joyce Weiland and everything, and I just realized, like, I've done an explicitly Brakhage-y film, and I've done one film that I realized while I was doing it was very Ernie Gare influenced, but I don't know if it's ever even crossed my mind to do something with like a Joyce Weiland or a Julie Murray style or influence. Mostly because Joyce Weiland's so unique, and I don't know what I could do with it. And Julie Murray's
so offended right now.
Well, jeez, I don't know. Anyway, Brakhage.
Everyone take a shot every time you say Brakhage.
Well, and I just wanted to add to that, if I could, really briefly. Sorry. It's okay. Just that I think it's about privilege too. That we also benefit from the privileges in Canada, in particular, of our works being protected. As artists with unique voices, with politics, with practices. I mean, I love the idea of paying and negotiating fair use, because I feel like there's a mutual respect in a system where both parties are protected, and I'm speaking specifically between artists and between exhibitors and artists and like-minded people at a similar strata. But if someone wanted to use, I mean, Mike, I can't even include you in this conversation because your work is so full of appropriation at this point, but you know, if you had shot original footage and someone wanted to use it from PepsiCo, I would be there to make sure that PepsiCo offered you a fair price. So I feel like we privilege not only from our works being protected in a certain system that understands cultural production and cultural value here, but I think we also enjoy the privileges of sharing and understanding. And it's within that I think our arguments both fail us and kind of undo us a little bit at the same time. So we can argue for appropriation as artists because we should be able to be critical and use the tools that are available to us to do that in culturally sophisticated, aesthetic, formal, and conceptual ways. But we also do that in a world that's got our back a bit. And I think in a world that has Brakhage-y things going on with pussy-y, riot-y things, I think we are put in a particular position, and I think it is a political one. Not to debate the past politics of appropriation, but to face a future where cultural production is becoming less and less politicized. So I would argue that if you are to appropriate, you are to do it in such a way that acknowledges the cultural landscape and circumstance that both political work and apolitical work sadly kind of share. It's the neutral stuff that gets in our way. It's the stuff that is not visible or articulated. It's the stuff that, like, Richard's appropriation is, I think, so valuable. But to see your work taken by someone else who has every corporate luxury, perhaps, to see it taken and reappropriated again seems kind of wrong. So we're in this middle ground without really, I think, enough acknowledgement of the things that make your appropriation work for you and keep you protected from the other.
Yeah.
almost death, so to speak.
If I can quote Lenin for a moment, at his well, political, in relation to analysis of concrete conditions, I think that it's very hard to come up with any kind of blanket statement, because I think, Alison, what you're talking about is that you can have a similar kind of act and you can frame it as appropriation or you can frame it as an homage, right? And so there are different ways in which this is why the legal argument has been so troubling to many of us, because it actually gets rid of all of those kinds of things, right? But I think what you're arguing for as well, Deirdre, is that it's hard to come up with, like, what is the purpose of coming up with a blanket endorsement or a blanket prohibition anyway, right? Whom does it serve? It doesn't serve the art. It doesn't serve us. It requires us to, in each instance, understand what is at stake, right? What are the stakes, and why are we making these judgments at any particular point? And I think sometimes it can be political, and sometimes it can be completely the opposite.
Someone, this person here is.
I've been interested in a lot of, you sort of touched on it a little bit, what the artist who's appropriating has to gain from the work that's screening. And sometimes that's out of their control. Sometimes their work screens very minimally, and they don't gain any incredible notoriety. But sometimes a work that incorporates appropriation, an artist might gain a lot of notoriety, and it might push their career forward, giving them a lot to gain. And at that point, does that undermine any critique that they might be making? Because we were talking about people taking their names off work. So if Clint, for example, and I'm using Clint because I know he's good with dialogue, and I'm not making him feel uncomfortable by using his example of his film. So if Clint, it's not. Does it not say Clint? Oh, no. So if you take Clint's work from example, just for conversation, if Clint's career just spiraled out of control because of that work, does it undermine any critique he's making of Benning and him being also a white male avant-garde filmmaker? Or is that still there? Can we talk about the relationship between what the artist has to gain and critique or support or homage? How much does your gain kind of undermine that idea?
You want to actually see it, and it's like meant to, it's not like also, it's not an homage, it's meant to like break from this like conversation. It's not other for you, it's like that's part of the critique.
Absolutely. And I didn't mean to single you out to talk about that work specifically. I meant to just sort of use it as an example to talk about this idea of what the artist has to gain and that relationship between any critique or support or homage they're doing. So, for example, the Benning and the Pussy Riot work, does anything that he has to gain undermine any sort of support that he's offering to Pussy Riot?
That's a really, really good question.
Can I say something?
Is it about the question?
Yeah, I like this question, of course, because I said what I said before, but I think I grew up in the age of video hacking, which I thought was a fantastic movement, and completely uncredited in my experience to walk into get a VHS that had been doctored, and I had no idea that
there's really a lot to say.
Yeah.
But
About
it's
what
like
the
how much
artist
time do we have? And yeah, but what the artist has to gain. I mean, the artist has a lot to gain. And I mean, we've all seen many instances of young artists sort of traffic, not to say, you know, not to in any way not support young artists, but, you know, of artists sort of working with other material in order to sort of try to gain influence and legitimize practices and this kind of thing. It's a phenomenon, also what was spoken about earlier. And I can't help but sort of like also think of my own experience as a young artist, as a student actually making a film that gained a certain amount of notoriety and was discussed in ways that I was actually surprised by as a kind of naive young artist, not really understanding the art world that well. I mean, I shouldn't sort of pretend that but whatever. And I think that there's really a lot at stake for artists. And I think it's a really important question. It's a really important question for artists to discuss honestly and to discuss with a lot of sort of to take very seriously in terms of like what's at stake, who is who benefits, who doesn't, and like really what are these sort of like to really unpacking the dynamics at play. I think it's crucially important. And I mean, I was sort of hoping that sorry, you guys are all looking at me like, come on, really? I was hoping that part of the discussion could sort of be about like if we agree that if we can sort of speak about some of these difficulties in appropriation and the sort of possibilities of harm or damage or of asymmetries, like how ought those be considered in a community of thinkers and critics and artists, and how ought those be really discussed and made relevant and made, I don't want to use the word accountable because it's like, but how ought we, because we know that there are many forces at play in the art world that are very powerful and that reward reward work that reward. Yes.
And because artists have so little, we don't see ourselves as liable. But if you tried to get your work on, you know, the broadcaster wanted it, they would make you have clearances and all these things which artists can't afford. So there are rewards as you move up the system, up the art system. It's a very particular kind of system that we have to decide whether or not we want its rewards, because I quite frankly am not sure, but you know, it does have its rewards. The Images Festival is an excellent example of an organization that works very, very hard to support the notion of artist fees, of which I'm assuming each and every one of you are being paid. There is a system of distribution, except for Mike. I mean, but no, to exhibit your work, or twice or three times in a festival. You know, there's VTAPE and CFMBC and distributors across the country that if we find, you know, someone wants to show you work twice, but they only pay once, we go back. We make sure that we get that money. So it's these rewards are all part of this conversation.
Man, I just wanted to say I have no idea which side of the table I'm on anymore. I've completely lost my compass, and I'm so grateful to you guys for helping me to lose my compass.
Can we have closing? I think we should go to closing remarks from each side. You want to start, Richard?
Well, I just want to respond to this, just to point out that the rewards and the obstacles are also different depending on whether one is in a gallery system or if the work is circulating through single-channel circuits, right? So that the gallery system is much more forgiving around appropriation. I mean, the work that circulates in the gallery, I mean, I don't think anyone cares very much. And even large galleries, you go into work that's completely, the work is completely appropriated, and the corporations don't do anything. Whereas the clearances, for example, for your work to circulate on television has become, I guess, virtually impossible, right?
Arte swallow.
That's interesting. but in North America, it would become impossible. So I think those things I just wanted to point out.
So closing statements?
Me first?
Well,
Oh.
someone.
Well, I had a closing statement before, and I don't know if it's. So there was. So my argument was that I had imagined was kind of like that artists ought not be restricted from using materials, but that they ought to be, that have a sense of responsibility towards that material and towards what it depicts. And then I was thinking about what are the principles that should be guiding that responsibility. And the first principle that came to mind, and I was sort of thinking about it again because of Jean-Marie Tennot's, the way that he was speaking about his film and the way that he was speaking about love for Ernest, Wandi, and Ernestine. And I was thinking about the notion of love as a guiding principle and thinking about my relationship to my own subjects in my work, and I can relate to that very strongly. And then I was thinking that maybe, in fact, that maybe it should be a kind of tough love, and that maybe then I was thinking that, in fact, there are many artists who are working with material and subjects that they might find despicable, and that wasn't a good one. That could be applied. And then I decided it ought to be respect. And again, for various reasons, it seemed to me that wasn't a sort of perfect choice. And then finally, I decided on care. That I think to care for works and subjects and contexts that we're creating to create a care as a guiding principle, I think is one that can go a long way. So that's what I'll end on.
Well, I don't know if I have any really closing remarks, but I did want to respond to like what the artists, you know, how'd you put it? What we, get out of this.
I was curious more about whether the artist's gaining notoriety undermines any critique or support theory. I'm not, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does the relationship between the critique and the notoriety that the artist receives because of the art, does it undermine?
Well, actually, but my comment was really much more of a personal one and about what an artist has to gain. And so I think that for me, and I'm just speaking for myself, that I work frequently in response to something else. Almost all of my work is nonfiction, and so it's really by the inspiration and motivation that I get from something else that I think is when I do my best work. And so for me, really, it has to do with just the personal, the intellectual, and the creative pleasure that I get when I'm in the process of creating a work. And I frequently spend years on a piece, and it's the time in the studio, it's the research that I do, it's the conversations that I have around it that are so incredibly fulfilling for me. They make me a better teacher, they make me a better partner, they just make me a better person in the world to have to consider and reconsider things over a period of time. And that's just part of my personal practice. And in some ways, the piece that goes out in the world is such a tiny little bit of like nothing compared to sort of like what I walk around with after I've completed something. And so I just want to put that out there that certainly you put work out in the world and you're open for criticism, and we should be, and people should be able to respond then to my work and then take that into another direction. But I think that if I was limited in my ability to access information so that I could be a better creative thinker, I'd shrivel as an artist, and I think we'd be boring people and the work would suck. And so I just want to say that I feel like it's, I think we all agree on this. It's sort of like access to information is crucial, and it's really just, then you decide how much you're going to use, how you're going to use it. The ethics do come into it, of course, but it's essential, for the creative process. Okay, so what did I say?
3 quick points. There's a form of poetry. It's called erasure, and the way that it works is that you have a poem that already exists, and then you erase parts of it. There was a Roman person. His name is Pausanias. He lived in the 4th century, and he provided certain rules for how you erase things. It's a form of poetry that's still being practiced today. That's the first thing. In other words, impossible without a form of poetry that would disappear without stealing, of course. Second point, I went back to school this year. I've been studying art at York University. And in my art classes, hardly a class goes by where one of my profs doesn't go to the internet and show a piece of motion picture art by an artist. The artists are not paid or credited. They have no way of knowing that their work is being shown or circulated. And to my astonishment, because I'm a naive person in so many ways, I didn't realize that university profs make like over $100,000 a year. And there was no effort in any way to either access the collection, the media collection that the university library owns and is paid for, because it's a drag, right? Like, oh, I have to fill out forms or I have to go all that way. Point number 2. Point number 3, they're all disconnected, of course, as usual. My most important memories, my deepest memories, I would say even that I share this trait with the already mentioned Phil Solomon, my deepest memories do not belong to me.
Yeah, that deserves a round of applause, I think. Wow. I mean, anyway, I'm glad I opened up this can of worms with the James Benning example. I'm sure James is thrilled that we're talking about him. And I see sort of 4 different positions. One that starts with an authoritarian position of government, and then trickles down to media, and then to political groups or outsider groups fighting against that, and then again with artists or other groups who are appropriating that message and spreading it into their own context through their own views. And then we have a culture of accountability, so we want to know who's responsible for what, and point fingers in certain directions. So it could start with Putin in Russia, or it could start with Pussy Riot, depending on how you look at it, or it could start with James Benning appropriating that material, or it could start with the mainstream news media who's distorted that material, and some artist has to restore integrity to that material, or render it in a way that's forceful and meaningful and instills it with radical politics. Again, I don't know who is accountable, where the solution starts or ends, but I feel like we have to be troublemakers. Of course, that's difficult to assert that when there are people in jail and then they're, or in a labor camp, like there are 2 members of Pussy Riot right now who, may certainly perish in a labor camp. That's really frightening to think about. And sometimes an artist maybe just has to step back and not make those decisions. And then sometimes maybe the artist does have to stand in and make those decisions and see what happens.
I don't know if I have any good points to make, so I'll just close with what I have here. Make no mistake, Metallica is not anti-technology.
I didn't have any closing remarks either, but as this conversation unfolded, a memory kind of came to me, which is that in the early 90s, I believe it's the early 90s because I have no memory anymore, I helped organize a conference called Shooting the System for Indigenous and film and video makers of color, and Alanis Obomsawin was one of the keynote speakers. And she made a very impassioned speech against cultural appropriation. And then in the middle of her speech, she said, "Except for Dances with Wolves." And then she went on to say how much she loved Dances with Wolves. And what the point of that was, it's all about specificity. And I think that what we find ourselves in a position, I think, as artists, independent artists, experimental artists, often arguing against the copyright regime and what it's doing, because it's coming from elsewhere, it's coming from above, it's coming from outside. So we find ourselves often in a kind of reactive position. And what I appreciated about this panel, even though the tables have completely merged into some kind of surrealist something, a lump, is that it has given us the opportunity to actually discuss things in much more complexity in the way that I think we experience them in real life. Thanks.
So I just wanted to thank you all and thank the panel. I really appreciate the fact that you did appropriate each other's arguments so much throughout. And I'll end by saying Dance of the Wolves sucks.
I wonder what she thinks about it now.
I got a bit jittery in my intro, and I just wanted to thank Elwood Jimmy and Kate Mackay for also contributing to organizing this panel. I want to thank the Monarch for hosting us. Please stay and have a beer and continue the debate. I'm so happy with the way that the two panels have unpacked this issue so thoughtfully. So thank you all for participating, and thanks for panel.
Because they are, in a way, we did ask them to both defend and critique their own practices, and I think that was very brave. And I was very impressed by the applause that we had and the way you all approached it, and were so open and generous with us with your ideas and thoughts. So thank